Father, please guide our teacher, Lord God, that he will uh, unearth God's word and share it to us, Lord God, by the help of the Holy Spirit, Lord. And I pray that you use him as your mouthpiece, Lord God, to share the truth. And I pray that we will learn a lot from him. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen. Maraming salamat po. Thank you po. Okay, you already had, so we talked about before your homework assignment for today, just working through the Olivet Discourse passages, coming up to speed and being familiar with them. And then I also, excuse me, gave you a reading, which is it's an excellent reading regardless, but from this book. And so actually, if you want to just buy the whole book, it's a good investment if you're wanting to understand, but particularly that chapter is very good. And it was my copy, so there's a couple of markings in there. Anyway, I don't think a ton of markings, but some different markings I already had. So then Dr. Collins is just going to talk us through this. And we had heard some of you had heard this content in a different form, but anyway, I'm looking forward to getting a repetition of it just to make sure I really got the concept solidly. And then I think the majority of us had not heard it before. So Dr. Collins, thank you again for an early morning and an early Thanksgiving morning. Welcome, Brother JR. Glad to see you. And so we're looking forward to what you have to share with us today.
Okay, great. I'm going to jump in with various approaches to interpreting the Olivet Discourse, and then I'll pause and I'll open it up for some questions about those interpretations, and maybe even some questions that you've had that the reading maybe raised for you. I would say that interpreters have understood the Olivet Discourse in at least four major ways. Some would limit the referent, that is, what Jesus is teaching about, exclusively to the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, or almost exclusively to the fall of Jerusalem, with the eschatological coming of Christ entering only after Matthew 24:36 or its parallel in Mark. And really the validity of this hangs on the interpretation of Matthew 24:29 through 31 in parallels. And that's the passage that talks about all these things happening in this generation. And we'll get to that. We'll get to that passage, Lord willing, in this study. I think that interpretation that puts everything in this chapter as being fulfilled in AD 70 is untenable. I don't think it's a very popular viewpoint right now. If you have anything by N.T. Wright, that would be his view. In fact, he wants to put everything in AD 70. I don't think he sees any future coming in the Olivet Discourse at all. Or if you have R.T. Francis commentaries. So he wrote the commentary on Matthew in the NIC&T commentary set, the New International Commentary set. He wrote the commentary of Mark in the New International Greek Testament commentary, and he wrote the commentary on Matthew in the Tyndale commentary series. So if you have those are standard commentaries, and if you're reading in there, this will be his position. He would take the position that that the second coming doesn't enter into the passage until after Matthew 24:36 or after Mark 13:32. Again, I don't think, though this is a popular view, I don't think really this one is tenable. At the opposite extreme are interpreters who hold the discourse to be entirely eschatological. Luz, who's the commentator on the Hermeneia series, he identifies this as the oldest view. He links it to the Didache, Irenaeus, Hippolytus, Hilary, or Cyril of Jerusalem. It's in more modern commentators who have held this view would be Schlatter and Zahn. However, I think it's difficult to exclude the destruction of the temple from AD 70 from the discourse, since it was Jesus' statement about its destruction that actually gave rise to the questions the disciples asked and to the discourse itself. So again, I don't think that's and that's not a very commonly held view. And even when he's referring to these as the oldest view. When I looked up at the citations he was giving, I was seeing that these people definitely held that the discourse was eschatological, but I couldn't personally tell that it was exclusively eschatological, for what it's worth. Another very common view, so this would be the third view, takes the discourse to be historical, that is, referring to the events of AD 70 and to the entire era from the destruction of the Jerusalem to the return of Christ. So what is often commonly called the church age. And part of the discourse is eschatological. So part of the discourse is historical, part of the discourse is eschatological. These interpreters differ, however, on where to draw the line between the historical and the eschatological sections. So the patristic author of the incomplete commentary on Matthew, we don't know who the author of this is, but we have an old commentary on Matthew that's actually very helpful. He said he knew of an interpreter who divided the sermon at the abomination of desolation. So what happened before the abomination of desolation referred to the offense of AD 70. What occurred after referred to the eschatological coming of Christ. For Calvin, Matthew 24, 1 through 8 and 15 through 22 refer to events of AD 70. Verses 9 through 14 and 23 through 28 refer to the entire period from the fall of Jerusalem to the end. And then 29 through 31 refer to the eschatological tribulation and coming. So you see, Calvin has three different parts there. AD 70, period from fall of Jerusalem to the end, and then eschatological tribulation and coming. Lange, who was a 19th century German commentator, he proposed the first part of the discourse unfolded in three cycles, from the apostles all the way down to the eschaton, and then another cycle from the approaching destruction of Jerusalem to the final judgment, and then a final cycle that was restricted just to the end. Now, people that you're most likely to come across that would hold this view would be D.A. Carson and Craig Blomberg. Carson wrote the Matthew commentary and Expositor's Bible commentary, and Blomberg wrote the New American commentary on Matthew. Both of these are very helpful commentaries. Both take Matthew 24, 4 through 28 to refer to the whole inner Advent period, with verses 15 to 21 focusing on the fall of Jerusalem, and verses 29 through 31 concerning the eschatological coming. Then verses 32 through 35 cover again the entire inner Advent period. Now, I think this approach is superior to the preceding two. In other words, it's superior to the one that says everything happened in AD 70, and it's superior to the one that where everything is said to happen eschatologically. But I think it suffers from two defects, at least, or maybe three defects. First, the lack of agreement as to what is historical and what is future, I think, casts some doubt on this approach. So a lot of people hold this view, but they don't really agree what's historical and what's future. So that might be a little warning sign. Second, Blazing observes that this approach renders the discourse somewhat confused, because Jesus is supposed to be addressing questions about the temple's destruction and his return at the end of the age. But for Carson and Blomberg, the discourse begins instead with general remarks about the church age, and then abruptly returns to the intended, I'm quoting Blazing here, abruptly returns to the intended agenda with the abomination of desolation, and then it rockets forward to the topic of Christ's second coming. And I think that's a legitimate critique. Third, these interpretations tend to neglect connections to the Old Testament passages, which I think locate the entire discourse within the framework of the day of the Lord. There's a day of the Lord framework to this entire discourse. So I prefer a fourth approach. I first came across this fourth approach in the Blazing selection that you all read today. But as I did some research, I found that this fourth approach actually reaches all the way back to the early church. In fact, Laws identifies Augustine as the originator of this view. And I think the view is well summarized in this incomplete commentary of Matthew, written by one of the church fathers, an anonymous church father. And this is what he says. The Lord does not say distinctly which signs pertain to the destruction of Jerusalem and which to the end of the world, namely, so that the same signs may seem to pertain to the manifestation of both the destruction of Jerusalem and to the manifestation of the end of the world, because he did not, whoops, I copied the wrong thing, sorry. I was hoping as I was reading this to be able to copy in for you what I was reading. My apologies. I'll pick it up here with, so the same signs may seem to pertain both to the manifestation of the destruction of Jerusalem and to the manifestation of the end of the world, because he did not explain to them in order like a history how the things were to be done, but in a prophetic manner, he predicted to them things that were to be done. I think what he means by prophetic manner there is, the prophets telescope events together, right? And that's what he's pointing out is happening here. Now, this view has commended itself to other interpreters throughout the ages. It was noted by Thomas Aquinas in his commentary on Matthew. Thomas is not entirely clear whether it is his view, because he lists various interpretations without specifying his preference, and it might be his view. Jonathan Edwards held to this view. Edwards says, in this chapter, respect is especially had to two events. One, the destruction of Jerusalem and the works of God that accompanied it, and the other, to the end of the world. And some things are most applicable to one, and others to another, as is common in those parts of Scripture that have respect to various events. Also, the 19th century Baptist commentator, John Broadus, held this view. Broadus notes that every attempt to assign a definite point of division between the two topics has proven a failure. You place it after verse 28, say, okay, up to this point, the former topic, or the destruction of Jerusalem is meant, and after that point, only the latter, the return of Christ. And at once we see, well, verse 34 has to refer to the destruction of Jerusalem. And I pasted the quote in there. You can see how he tries out several different breaking points, and he notes he notes none of these are really good breaking points. But his final sentence there, I think, is important. But if the destruction of Jerusalem was itself, in one sense, a coming of the Lord, why may we not suppose that the transition from this to the final coming is gradual? In other words, maybe some of it's referring, at some points, it's referring to both of these. And I'm going to say it's actually referring, my argument will be the whole discourse is about the day of the Lord, typologically in AD 70 and the events leading up to it, and then in terms of the antitype, the eschatological day of the Lord. The English expositor Henry Elford agreed. He said it must be borne in mind that the whole is spoken in the pregnant language of prophecy, in which various fulfillments are involved, the destruction of Jerusalem and the final judgment being both enwrapped in the words. So the same words are capturing both of these ideas. And then this view was popular among Dutch theologians. So Gerhardus Voss, Herman Ridderbos, and Anthony Heckema also take this view. Voss said, the answer of the Savior, in the answer of the Savior, a sharp division is not made between what belongs to one and what belongs to the other. It is very difficult for us to make a division. And by one and the other, he means AD 70 and the eschatological salvation. And then Herman Heckema, he said, as we read the discourse, however, we find that aspects of these two topics are intermingled. Matters concerning the destruction of Jerusalem, epitomized by the destruction of the temple, are mingled together with matters which concern the end of the world. So much so that it is sometimes hard to determine whether Jesus is referring to the one or the other, or to both. Obviously, the method of teaching used here by Jesus is that of prophetic foreshortening, in which events far removed in time and events near in the future are spoken of as if they were close together. Now, Craig Blazing defends this approach by observing that Christ himself did not know the day or the hour of his return. So Blazing says, thus, Jesus by his own admission does not know whether AD 70 destruction and the parousia will be one and the same or two different events. Blazing's argument is that Matthew 24, 4 through 35 sets out a pattern that links Daniel's time of the end, that would be Daniel's 70th week, or 70th 7, with the day of the Lord. The whole pattern is the parousia. However, just as was the case in the Old Testament, it is possible for a type of the eschatological day of the Lord to appear in history in advance of the antitype. So Blazing concludes, In the case of the Olivet Discourse, the narrative structure, which is itself a synthesis of the prophetic pattern, the day of the Lord and Daniel's time of the end, he's synthesizing those two things together, references both the AD 70 destruction and the future parousia, or the future coming, with language that may be wholly applicable to one, wholly applicable to the other, or equally applicable to both at the same time. And that's the view that I want to defend today. But before we keep moving, any questions that these four interpretive options raised for you, or any questions that you had from your reading of Blazing in preparation for this, or even your reading of the sermon, the discourse, any of those questions that you want to raise at the beginning to make sure we get addressed as we go through. And I may address them right away, or I may say we'll come to that. We'll talk about that more.
So just to be clear, the fourth view takes all of the elements of the passage and says they both refer to AD 70 and the future, as opposed to view 3?
Right, until there's a certain point where everybody's going to say, okay, we've now shifted fully to the end, which is there's the part that actually describes the return of Christ in the clouds, and people on view 4 are going to see that as being strictly eschatological. But all the way up to that point, they're going to see both the type events leading up to AD 70 and AD 70 and the antitype together. What they're going to argue is that these are both giving us a cohesive day of the Lord event, one typical and then the one the antitypical, or the eschatological. Good question.
Something I like about this is it feels like it gives you more continuity between some of the patterns you see in Old Testament prophecy, like Old Testament. What was Old Testament prophecy that also points to something that is still eschatological for us? Where you have this kind of, like, if you think of Daniel 11 or something, where you kind of move across straight from something, and at times you're not even sure exactly where you are, or Joel 2, where you're just moving straight across from a near term and a far term day of the Lord kind of. So, I mean, when you get that, we typically talk about, like, I don't like the language of this, but double fulfillment, or near term, far term, or some kind of typology echo kind of thing. We typically talk about that and restrict that to exilic era prophets. But here you're picking up on it in the ministry of Jesus, and it maintains more of a continuity. It seems to make some sense as you come across.
Right, and if you notice, some of the very oldest interpreters of this passage, they were picking up on that. They were saying what Jesus is doing is just what the prophets were doing. And so again, they're looking at their Bibles, they're very familiar with their Bibles, and they're saying, oh, I understand what Jesus is doing. He's doing just what the prophets are doing. So if I read my Bible over here, it helps me understand what's going on in my Bible over here. This class is on intertextuality, and this is happening not just in terms of specific referencing of texts, but just understanding the way that prophetic texts work in the Old Testament are going to inform how we understand Jesus's prophetic discourse here. So yeah, I think that's a strong argument for it. The other thing I like about this approach is everything hangs together. So instead of saying, okay, there's all these things that show up in Matthew, and they also show up all throughout church history at different points. We have earthquakes all the time, and we have diseases, and we have this and we have that. This is saying, actually, it's not just that these things happen. These things actually have always happened. They happened before the Olivet Discourse. They're going to happen all. Actually, these things come together. That they're part of a unit, and they all function together. I think that makes this. We'll get into that a little bit more, but I think that strengthens this reading as well.
Something that. But this charge goes against any of the approaches. So, like, when you presented this before, and then, okay, great, I think I kind of got the framework and such. So then I went and read through the passage. It was not immediately obvious to me where to plug in as I'm reading different, this verse, where to understand what's going on. And meaning, it's just not immediately intuitive. as you read the passage, you're kind of, so it feels like, okay, great, I can come up with a scheme, or we've got a scheme and we can make this work. That's a little unfair. And I'm looking forward to hearing how you will work through again. And I think maybe at this point, I hopefully will absorb more of it. The counter argument with that would be, certainly if you read some of these other guys and they're splitting it somewhere in the middle, this is everything here and that's everything after. None of that's going to be intuitive. Nobody's going to just pick that up from, a quick reading or something.
Yeah, so. in some ways, we are. I think this view is the simpler of the views, because I'm not having to try to figure out what's eschatological, what's 80-70. Now, I guess you could say the first two, all eschatological or all 80-70, would be the simpler. But I don't think either of those are tenable. So out of the two that I think are tenable, this ends up being the simpler, because you're saying, oh, it's all the type or all the antitype. It's just, I'm not really having to distinguish per se through the two. Brother Kenneth asked if we're going to be sticking with Matthew's gospel or referring to the other two. I'm probably just going to give you references in Matthew and let you know that there's parallels, because it gets confusing if I start to have to list out all the verse references for everything. But what I did in preparation for this was actually study this in harmony. So I got a harmony of the gospels and I color coded everything. So I knew what was Matthew, what was Mark, and what was Luke, and what was overlapped and so forth. And that is the way that I studied through the passage. And at certain points, we will highlight one or the other gospels, because there are places, I think, where they diverge. I should say this, and I probably would say it anyway at some point in the lecture, but I do think that all the gospels are focused on the type and the antitype together. But Luke, I think, focuses on the type. He focuses on 80-70. That's where his emphasis is. Matthew focuses on the eschatological coming, and Mark is kind of in between. So when Jesus gives the discourse, he has all of this actually in mind, the type and the antitype. But as the Holy Spirit inspires the gospel writers to record, the Spirit actually inspires Matthew to emphasize the eschatological, and Luke to emphasize the typological. Very good question. Well, let's jump into this. We'll begin with Matthew 24, 1 through 3, and the parallels. What happens in these verses is Jesus is leaving the temple, and this is actually the last time that he will have been in the temple and is leaving the temple. And there may be something symbolic about this departure. The judgment may have actually been implied in this departure. Here he is. He's leaving the temple. He's been rejected. And there's maybe something of a parallel between the time when Yahweh left the temple in Ezekiel 10. So now the Messiah is leaving the temple. One of the things I think this parallel may be in view is all three of the Gospels note that Jesus had pronounced judgment on the Jewish leaders. And this judgment aspect of the departure, I think, may have been apparent to the disciples. If you look back to Matthew 23, to verse 38, Matthew records that Jesus proclaimed to them, "Your house is left to you desolate," which is a word of judgment that I think is somewhat parallel to that Ezekiel 10 departure of Yahweh. And I wonder if the disciples' praise of the temple buildings may have been a response. I see Duncan is posting, he follows my website, and I posted some of this on my website. Duncan, you're going to eventually run out of places where I posted, but if people want to click over there, you'll see basically my manuscript for this. So I think the disciples, they're praising the temple at the beginning of chapter 24, and I think they're responding perhaps to the saying of Jesus, "The house is left desolate." They maybe want Jesus to affirm the temple splendor. This is a sign of God's presence. At the very least, I think their response shows them to be out of step with Jesus's viewpoint of the temple at this point. Because Jesus's response to their praise of the temple is, "There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." That's Matthew 24:2. That's what provokes the questions from the disciples. All of the Gospels record the disciples saying, "When will these things be?" Which is clearly asking Jesus, when is the temple going to be destroyed? You said all, these stones will be thrown down not one upon the other. When will that happen? Now Matthew pairs this question with another, given in two parts. This is what Matthew says in 24:3. And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And I think here the disciples are linking the destruction of the temple with the eschatological coming of Christ, which they don't know when that'll happen, but they're, when is your eschatological coming to set everything right? Same thing happens in Mark, though with less clarity. So in Mark 13:4, they say, what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished? And you might not just on an initial read through pick up as that being an eschatological phrase, but all these things to be accomplished is actually an allusion. Here's where intertextuality comes in. It's an allusion to Daniel 12:6-7. And that passage describes a time of trouble for Israel, such as has never been since there was the nation till that time, according to 12:1. And in the course of that vision, someone says, how long shall it be till the end of these wonders? That's the same, end and accomplished, I think, are the same words in Greek. So the Greek translation of Daniel and Mark is written in Greek. That's the same term. The response is that it would be for a time, a times, and half a time, and that when the shattering of the power of the holy people comes to an end, all these things would be finished. And again, and all these things would be finished. That's parallel wording between Daniel and Mark. Now you can see already with time, times, and half a time, that's an allusion to Daniel's 70th seven. And I'm not going to get into some of the details of why we know that, so I'm just going to assert that at this point. But that's why Blazing is saying there's an integration here between Day of the Lord and Daniel 70th seven that's going on here in the Olivet Discourse. According to Luke, Jesus was leaving the temple and the disciples asked him, Luke 21:7, what will be the sign when these things are about to take place? Now Luke, as I mentioned, is maybe the least eschatological of the three gospel writers. He's maybe more focused on the destruction of the temple than the others, AD 70. But the plural things, that might indicate that more than just the temple is view, although it might just mean that Luke is more focused on the temple destruction. Clearly, the disciples linked the destruction of the temple and the Son of Man's coming at the end of the age. They expected these things to happen as a single event. And Jesus, who in this discourse states he did not know the timing of these events, and thus whether or by how much they're separated, he treats them together. And I think it's appropriate for him to link these two events, because the events accompanying the judgments on the guilty city will be the foreshadowing of the final judgment of the second advent. This may even be fitting that the destruction of the temple is a foreshadowing of the day of the Lord, because the temple is a microcosm of the cosmos. So the judgment on the one symbolized the judgment on the other. Okay, let's look now at Matthew 24:4-8 and its parallels. So Matthew 24:4-8, this is where Jesus tells the people that they shouldn't let people lead them astray, saying, I'm the Christ. They're going to hear wars and rumors of wars, but don't be alarmed. The end is not yet. Nation will rise up against nation. There'll be famines and earthquakes in various places, and all these things are but the beginning of the birth pains. So that's the section that we're looking at right now, Matthew 24:4-8. I would say that these verses were clearly fulfilled typologically in the years between Christ's ascension and the destruction of the temple in AD 70. And many commentators describe these historical fulfillments. Aquinas, Alford, Jonathan Edwards, but the clearest that kind of summarizes how these things were fulfilled historically is Craig Blomberg in his Matthew commentary, NAC. He note, I just pasted that in, and I'll read this. Various messianic pretenders arose, most notably Theudius, who describes and the Josephus describes some other people as well. There was a war of Israel against Rome that began in AD 66-67 and was preceded by growing hostility incited by the Zealots. There was famine in Judea that Acts 11 predicted, and we can date that to AD 45-47. We know of an earthquake that shook Laodicea at AD 60 to 61 and in Pompeii in AD 62. So we look at the events of these things and we say, okay, in the years leading up to AD 70, we find all of these things that Jesus called the beginning of birth pains happening. However, I think, as is typical when you have type and antitype, the type only foreshadows a fuller fulfillment of the type. So Luz, he notes that when they say, I am the Christ, he says, I don't think that's just a messianic claim, which is what was going on with Thudius. He says, I think this is actually somebody saying, I am Jesus Christ. And even if the claim is understood, generally, you would still see the fuller fulfillment of that in the Antichrist. The Antichrist is the ultimate false Christ that will appear in history. So I think the first century shadows point to a fuller fulfillment. Now, many interpreters, and this is where I would say views 3 and 4 diverge most clearly, is in these verses. Many interpreters understand these verses to describe the entire inner Advent period. This would be D.A. Carson, this would be Blomberg, this actually would be Craig Keener. And even some who in general see later parts of the discourse as occurring, as we see in view 4, both AD 70 and the future, they would see these verses, though, exclusively focused on the entire inner Advent period. That would be the view of Turner in the Baker Exegetical Commentary. And what these interpreters pick up on is Jesus' statement, but the end is not yet, or the end is not immediately, in verse 6 and its parallels. They think that this indicates this section cannot present the events of the eschatological day of the Lord. Now, I think it's best to understand these verses as referring, again, typologically to the first century and to the ultimate day of the Lord. So we have to determine what is the end with view to the type and what is the end eschatologically. In terms of the type, the end in view is the destruction of the temple. There's a definite first century referent to the end as far as the type is concerned. Regarding the antitype, I think the end is referring to the end of the messianic birth pangs that verse 8 refer to, which signify the time of great trouble that precedes the son's return to earth. So it'll be the end of that. I think Voss actually has a really helpful statement about this. He says, an infant cannot be born without pains. So too, whoops, did I copy the right thing in here? No. I'm trying to copy these quotes in because I know it's difficult to just hear somebody read a long section of text. I'm sorry. Oh yeah, there we go. Joel, help me out here. Thank you. It's hard, I know, sometimes to hear somebody just read a lengthy quote, so I'm trying to put these into the comments. As an infant cannot be born without pains, so too the rebirth of the entire earthly creation, which coincides with the end, will occur under terrible labor pains. The beginning of those pains consists of wars, sicknesses, famines, and earthquakes. In itself, all of this world, all of this would not yet be something special. Well, Luke 21:11 tells us that this will be accompanied by terrible things and great signs from heaven, thus by something absolutely extraordinary. So it will be easy to distinguish them, that is, these earthquakes, wars, sicknesses, famines, and so forth, from the ordinary disasters and distresses. So I hope you're picking up on what Voss is saying there. He's saying, okay, yeah, we have earthquakes and wars and sicknesses that always occur in history, but these are going to happen in an extraordinary way at the end. And one of the ways we know this is these are birth pangs. Now, when do birth pangs happen? Birth pangs don't happen like at month 1 or like before you've conceived. Birth pangs happen right at the end, right before you give birth. And what is being birthed? Well, a new creation is being birthed. And so we're going to expect the birth pangs to happen at the end, not not all throughout church history. I think Carson, even though he takes the other view, view 3, I think he provides some helpful information about the birth pains. He notes that birth pains in verse 8, Matthew 24, stems from such passages as Isaiah 13:8, Isaiah 26:17, Jeremiah 4:31, and 6:24, and Micah 4:9 through 10. And he says, by this time, it was almost a special term, birth pangs of the Messiah, a period of distress preceding the Messianic age. Of course, Messianic age would be another way of saying the millennium. And here are people, they're looking at these Old Testament texts, and they're saying, okay, there's going to be these birth pangs right before the Messianic age. And so again, even though Carson takes the different view, I think he's actually giving me a good argument here to see these birth pangs aren't something that go all the way throughout history. These birth pangs have an eschatological focus to them. Now, most of the Old Testament passages Carson cites refer to Israel writhing under historical judgments, but Isaiah 13 in particular links the image with the eschatological day of the Lord. And I think significantly, Paul alludes to the birth pangs in the Olivet Discourse as the description of the onset of the day of the Lord in 1 Thessalonians 5:3. So here's Paul. He picks up, here's intertextuality, not just Old Testament, New Testament, but Gospels and epistles here going on. So Paul, he's writing before the Gospels have been written, but he knows about the Olivet Discourse, I would argue. And he's interpreting these verses as referring ultimately to the final day of the Lord. These birth pangs, 1 Thessalonians 5:3, depict the onset of the day of the Lord. Furthermore, and I think this is important, the distinction between the initial birth pangs and the end reveals that the final day of the Lord is not an instantaneous event. This would be G.K. Beale's view. He says the day of the Lord happens like that. Christ returns. Here he is. That's the day of the Lord. It's we would say that day doesn't necessarily mean. It doesn't always mean 24-hour period. Day can mean a period of time. In this case, we're going to say it's probably a 7-year period of time. Day of the Lord is a 7-year period of time. G.K. Beale says day doesn't mean day, it means second. No, I don't think so, because Jesus is saying, here's the beginning of the birth pangs, and these things are going to unfold over time, and then they're going to culminate in the very end. Laws captures the meaning of this section of the discourse well when he acknowledges the first century applicability. He says, thus begin the pangs, that is the tribulation of the last days. Thus all of that is not yet the end, but it does deal with the beginnings of the end. And I think that's what's going on. Here's a good time for questions. And I see a couple here showing up in the comments. Zamthandian says, so all the disaster happening in today's world means just the initiative signs. So I would say that the disaster happening in today's world are not yet the initiative signs. We don't know when those initiative signs are going to show up. That's important. Nobody knows when the day of the Lord will begin. And yet here are all these signs showing up in Matthew 24 and its parallels. Well, how do we make sense of that? Nobody knows when it's going to begin, but here are these signs. Well, I think what nobody knows will begin is when the day of the Lord begins. And then once you're within the day of the Lord, then you start to get signs of the final, I could say the coming proper. Because I think that whole period that we call the day of the Lord, we could call the coming as well. That term parousia, or coming, refers not just to the final return of Christ to earth with the angels, Revelation 19, but I think it refers to that whole day of the Lord period is the coming. And I think it begins with his coming to rapture his own, and then it continues with a coming in judgment, and then it culminates in the coming proper, where he actually returns to earth. Brother Kenneth said day of the Lord equals an event, not specifically a time frame. Do you want to expand on what you're thinking there, Brother Kenneth? Oh, I think your microphone is muted.
Okay, no, like it's not a specific day, snap, or kind of thing, but rather the day of the Lord actually is talking about the entire judgment of the Lord. So it's a whole, until all the events relating to the judgment are, are completed. That is the day of the Lord, basically the coming of the judgment.
Yes, and I would say specifically the coming of eschatological. Yeah, and Brother Arnold, Dr. Arnold put in the comments like an entire complex of events. The day of the Lord is not a simple event; it's an entire complex of events that's going to come. I would say over a because it gets integrated with Daniel 77. I'm going to say it's going to happen over a 7-year period of time. Brother Zamfan Lian said, "You think some part of Revelation is starting to fulfill in our days?" I actually know if you're talking about chapter 6 all the way through to the end, I think that too is day of the Lord, and that is entirely future. I believe we do not know when that will begin. Right. I don't think chapter 6 and 7 are beginning to fulfill in our days. In fact, chapter 6 of Revelation is picking up on the very passage that we're looking at right now, the very verses we're looking at right now. There's intertextuality between Olivet Discourse and Revelation chapter 6. And I think when I look at the Olivet Discourse and I understand, oh, this is eschatological day of the Lord, typological 80-70, or eschatological day of the Lord. And then I see John pick up on that intertextuality with Revelation 6. I see, okay, that too is eschatological day of the Lord.
Can I try something and see see what you think? So
Yeah.
your previous discussion had come to mind recently because I was working in Micah. I was working on intertextuality between Matthew 2 and Micah 5:2. O Bethlehem Ephratah, too little be among the clans of Judah. So this is clearly messianic. Okay, but what kind of made my eyes bug out was right after that, and I worked through a number of commentaries. I'm convinced this is what's going on. So this is messianic. Therefore, he shall give them up until the time when she who is in labor has given birth. Then the rest of his brothers shall return to the people of Israel. And so that would be, I'm convinced, that would be coming. I mean, there's some echoes here of, this is, okay, the Messiah will be born, but actually ultimately eschatological because we're talking about the rest of his brothers' return. So kind of in a Revelation 12 kind of way, right? The suffering of the nation. And then it goes straight into eschatology. He shall stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord. So you've got this, she who is in labor has given birth, but that is a near term echo back here to 4:9, which is what Carson referenced, that pain seized you like a woman in labor. Why do you cry aloud, writhe and groan, O daughter of Zion, like a woman in labor? Which in the near term is Babylon, and so you will be rescued and so forth. But actually chapter 4 is super eschatological because in that day declares the Lord, I will assemble the lamb, gather those who have been driven away. I mean, this is the passage where it's talking about they will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. So, I mean, 4 is super eschatological. In the middle of that, you have this kind of near-term type sort of thing going on. And yet when it gets picked up again in 5 and the labor pains is picked up again, it's directly antitypical in the sense of eschatological. Anyway, I mean, my eyes kind of bugged out with that in terms of how then I would do the birth pains in Olivet Discourse if you're putting some of those pieces together. And at least Carson felt that those fit together. What do you think?
Yeah, no, that's great. I would want to probe that a little bit more to see if that birth pangs language in chapter 4 that you were just showing, how tightly I could connect that to what Jesus is talking about. One of the things that is exciting about intertextuality is you see all these connections. But one of the things to be careful of is sometimes you're like, oh yeah, I see all these connections, but they're maybe a little too loose. And I think Beale ends up doing that sometimes. Like he makes all these connections, you're like, oh, that's really cool. But then you start to probe them and you're like, oh, that's a little he's not always precise enough or careful enough. Now in this case, I do wonder if we can. What you said sounds initially good to me. Like if we dug into that, we would actually, instead of the threads kind of falling apart like a spider's web, you might actually see how they pull together, and you would come up with something stronger there.
Like Duncan had brought up, and this is more in semantic or in linguistics, but like illegitimate totality transfer, and
Yes.
doing a form of that with where you see echoes of language, and then you're like, okay, everything in this passage is also in this passage. I kind of want to see something specific enough that it's intentional before I just pull in all the content from somewhere else.
Right.
So,
Yeah, no, that's true. Brother Algonado Angeles says, how do you relate Matthew 24:29 to Revelation 6:12? Will it happen in the midst of the 70th week of Daniel? That's a very difficult question because the part of the Olivet Discourse that Revelation 6:12 picks up on is actually the part where it's actually talking about the return of Christ. Yeah, that Matthew 24:29 and Revelation 6:12, which would, unless you hold to a view where the seals and the trumpets and the bowls recapitulate, where like they take you from the beginning to the end, to the beginning to the end, to the beginning to the end. They're not progressive. Unless you hold to that view, Revelation 6:12 would seem to be coming too early. In fact, this would be one of the strongest passages for arguing for recapitulation. Now, I actually don't hold the recapitulation. I hold that the trumpets come out of the seals and the bowls come out of the trumpets. So what do I think is going on there? I think that what's going on there is when you get to the end of the sixth seal, that John is describing the judgments in a way that prefigures the very end. And so, because each of the end of these cycles is actually kind of pointing us to the end, and then John delays us before we actually really get to the end. So I would see that definitely as alluding back to the Olivet Discourse, but I don't think it's actually taking us all the way to the end at that point. I think it's kind of a prefigurement of the end. We could get into that more, but we're only at the very beginning of the Olivet Discourse, so maybe we should. Well, Brother Joel, should we break now and then pick up at what will be 8 o'clock my time, or what do you think?
Sure, sounds good. That sounds legitimate enough. So I've got 8:53 or 8:54 our time. So anyway, maybe right at the hour we can jump back in, beginning of the hour.
Okay, great.
Thanks.
This means we aren't going to make it through all the way through all of the Olivet Discourse, but that's okay, because the part that we just covered is the part where a lot of the debate is as to where these things go. The farther along we get in the passage, then people start to agree, oh yeah, all this happens eschatologically. It's the part that happens earlier on where people are debating about where things are. So I think in terms of addressing the kind of the contested things, I think we're going to be doing okay. Now Matthew 9:24, 9 through 14 is interesting. It talks about being delivered up to tribunals and being put to death, hated by all nations for Jesus' namesake. Many will fall away. They'll betray one another, they'll hate one another. Many false prophets will rise and lead many astray. Lawlessness will be increased. The one who endures to the end will be saved. And the gospel of the kingdom will be preached to all the nations, and then the end will come. That's in Matthew. Now, this is a point where you might also want to turn over to Luke 21, 12 through 19. That's the parallel here. Luke 21, 12 through 19. Is that correct? Yes. Where it says, but before all these things, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you and so forth. What's interesting here is these verses, though they're all about persecution in all the passages, there's a seeming discrepancy between Matthew and Luke at this point. Matthew begins this section in verse 9 with then, which would make you think, okay, these are things that are going to follow the beginning of birth pangs. Whereas Luke begins with, but before all this. In other words, before the beginning of these birth pangs. Now, Luke's time reference here is the clearest. Before false messiahs, before the wars, before the earthquakes, before the famines, before the heavenly signs, Jesus' followers would be persecuted by both Jews and Gentiles. And in fact, if we're thinking in terms of AD 70, all of these things we see show up in Acts. And I'm going to paste in something from Garland's commentary on Luke in the Zondervan series that indicates that, yes, in Acts, people laid hands on them. They persecuted them. They handed them over to synagogues, to jail. They put people in jails. These were kings and governors they stood before. So all of these things, I think that's striking, that just that paragraph of phrases and references, I think it's striking how much of this that Luke talks about actually shows up in Acts. I think Luke's account of the discourse affirms that these persecutions will precede the earthquakes and the famines and the heavenly signs and so forth that are going to characterize the time immediately before AD 70. Now, Luke's account affirms that this persecution will be an opportunity to bear witness to the gospel, which is also what Acts is recounting. I mean, that's kind of the main point of Acts, right? The spread of the gospel throughout the world. And divine empowering to present this witness without forethought may be exemplified by Stephen in Acts 7. So I think these verses in Luke clearly describe the persecution of the church described in Acts before the events leading up to the destruction of the temple in AD 70. Now, Mark's account is similar to Luke's. This is where it was helpful to have the parallel of the Gospels and to see what was shared by the Gospels and what was different from them. Mark is similar to Luke's. He adds that the followers of Jesus would be beaten in synagogues, which also occurred in Acts 5 and Acts 22. Matthew, though, is significantly different than Luke. When I was color coding the synoptics, I found Matthew stood out. In both Matthew and Luke, Jesus' followers are delivered up. They're hated for his name's sake. They're put to death. But Matthew uses different wording to describe this. And Matthew doesn't mention the Jewish leaders. He doesn't mention Sanhedrin. He doesn't mention councils. He doesn't mention synagogues, as Mark and Luke do. In fact, if I want to find wording in Matthew that's exactly parallel or very similar in terms of parallelism to what's in Luke and Mark at this point, it's not in Matthew 24, but it is in Matthew. It's actually in Matthew chapter 10. So I think that's interesting. And so Matthew, he's taken this material that Mark and Luke have in the Olivet Discourse, and Matthew has that back earlier. Now you might wonder, why is that? Well, Jesus is a traveling preacher. So Jesus is going to say the same things in different times and in different places. So it's not, I think we need to keep this in mind whenever we're interpreting the Gospels. If we see Jesus saying the same thing in two different Gospels in two different situations, it's probably because he said the same thing in two different situations. I think some of you probably can identify with this. Several of you are pastors, and you've traveled actually to different places and given the same sermon. I'm guessing that's happened to probably quite a number of people that are sitting in on this. So that's what Jesus is doing. So what he said in this section of the Olivet Discourse in Luke, he had actually said earlier, and Matthew records the earlier occurrence. And so he's not going to repeat all of that here. He's going to repeat a different part of the Olivet Discourse. So I think what Matthew records, Jesus said that too, as well as saying what he said in Luke. And the way the Holy Spirit inspired the gospel writers to record these discourses, there's different emphases. So Matthew here is going to have an eschatological emphasis in his. In Matthew's account, Jesus indicated that in conjunction with, or just following the initial birth pangs, this persecution is going to come. And this persecution will be exacerbated as people fall away from the faith and then betray believers. And again, I think Paul picks up on this part of the discourse. He's interpreting this part of the discourse eschatologically. Because in 2 Thessalonians 2:3, which I do think is built on the Olivet Discourse, Paul refers to the apostasy or the rebellion that accompanies the appearance of the man of lawlessness. And in Matthew, contributing to the apostasy are false prophets. And there were certainly many of these in the first century. Acts, Galatians, Romans, Colossians, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, 2 Peter, Jude, 1 John, 2 John. These all these Bible passages refer, Bible books refer to false prophets. But the work of the false prophets culminates in the false prophet, Revelation chapter 13. And so I think in contrast to the apostates, those who endure throughout the day of the Lord, they are going to be saved. I think that's what Matthew 24:13 is talking about. To close out this section, Jesus said, and this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. And I think with regard to the type, this prophecy refers to the spread of the gospel throughout the known world of that day. For instance, Paul could say that the gospel is prospering in the world, Colossians 1:6, and even that it's been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, Colossians 1:23. I think there Paul's probably indicating with expansive language the gospel has gone to all the nations and is continuing to spread among them. In principle, it's already gone worldwide. It's not just constrained to the Jews. However, I think this typological fulfillment of the saying does not exhaust its significance. The ultimate end in view is the one mentioned in Matthew 24:6, the end of the day of the Lord when the Son of Man returns. By that point, the gospel literally taken will spread to the entire world, and then the end will come. In fact, the Old Testament prophets, they look forward to the day when all the nations be gathered to worship God, and I think there may be an allusion to that here. Revelation predicts the worldwide proclamation of the gospel in chapter 5 and in chapter 7 and chapter 14. So I think the ultimate fulfillment of this prophecy will come to pass during the day of the Lord, predicted by Revelation. Now, one last thought about Matthew 10 before we move on. Matthew 10 is where the part that parallels Luke and Mark shows up. And Matthew 10 starts off recounting events in the lifetime of Jesus and his disciples. But by the time we get to the end of that passage, it actually has moved into an eschatological viewpoint. And I think the eschatological nature of Matthew 10 actually then casts the parallels of Mark 13 and Luke 21 in a little bit of different light. Though Luke certainly emphasizes the typological fulfillment in his presentation, the eschatological is not entirely absent in Luke and Mark. In Mark in particular, there are two eschatologically oriented parallels with Matthew. The gospel will be preached to all the nations, and the one who endures to the end will be saved. So again, I think these are matters of emphasis. I do think in this part of Matthew, he's probably pretty well focused eschatologically. I'm looking at that based on the way that the parallels with Mark and Luke work out. Mark and Luke are typological, AD 70, early church, preceding that, but not without having kind of an eschatological nod toward the end. So if I'm going to wrap all this up, let me grab Brother Kenneth's question here. What part of Matthew 10 is eschatological? Okay. So this is when Jesus is instructing the 12. He's sending them out on a mission, and when he tells them to limit their mission to the Jews, in verse 5, we know that's their initial earthly ministry during Jesus's their ministry during Jesus's earthly ministry. But by verse 18, the Gentiles are actually in view, and the persecution envisioned in 10:17 to 22 goes far beyond anything that actually occurred during Jesus's ministry, and that's pretty well acknowledged by all the commentators. By verses 22 and 23, I think the end and the coming are actually in view. So I think the passage culminates on an eschatological note. You can see this in Davies and Allison in their ICC commentary, and in Nolan in his NIGTC commentary. So the phrase in Matthew 10, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes, actually is obviously not true if it refers to the 12's evangelistic mission during Jesus' earthly ministry. And there's two possible ways to interpret this, both which go all the way back to the early fathers. Some people would say that that these verses indicate that the mission to Israel will not be complete before the second coming. In other words, there's still going to be a mission to evangelize the Jews all the way until Christ comes. You'll not go through all the towns of Israel until Christ comes. You're going to still be evangelizing them until Christ comes. Another option is that these words don't denote the mission, but they denote the flight of the disciples. So the beginning of the verse says, when they persecute you in the city, flee into another, and this flight will not be complete until Christ returns. And that reading may actually parallel Revelation 12:13-17. Both of these interpretations go all the way back to the church fathers. This latter one to the incomplete commentary on Matthew, the former one to Hilary of Poitiers. But in either case, the passage would ultimately end on an eschatological note. Good question. Did I answer your question too, Duncan? The one who endures to the end will be saved?
I think so. I'm just, I didn't catch if there are a couple possibilities for how we would read the end there in 10:22. If it would have a similar kind of two possibilities like the flight in 10:23.
Let's see, Matthew 10:22. I'm inclined, given its context, to see that as primarily eschatological, maybe completely eschatological. But I can see, if somebody wants to argue for it already yet, I would entertain that, look at it. But right now, I'm inclined to see that as eschatological. Okay, let me wrap up this first section of the Olivet Discourse, kind of into a bundle, and see if we have any further thoughts on this. So many understand Matthew 24:4-14 to describe the entire church age. And it's certainly true that false Christ, wars, famines, earthquakes, persecutions have existed since the church was established until the present. However, I don't think these verses are giving a disjointed list of events that will happen in a scattered fashion over a lengthy period of time. The events in these verses occur together and form a pattern. And that pattern was first filled in AD 70, or the years leading up to it, and it will be ultimately fulfilled in the eschatological day of the Lord. There were antichrists leading up to AD 70, but in the last day, the Antichrist will appear, Revelation 13. There were wars and rumors of wars preceding AD 70, but in the last day, they will increase, Revelation 6:3-4. There are famines in the early years of the church, but they will be devastating during the ultimate day of the Lord, Revelation 6:6-8. Earthquakes occurred prior to Jerusalem's fall, but in the last day, the earthquakes will be utterly world-shaking, Revelation 6:12, 8:5, 16:18. The believers of the early church were persecuted, but the tribulation period will be a time of unprecedented persecution, Revelation 6:9-11. There were false prophets in the early decades of the church, but the false prophet will arise alongside the Antichrist, Revelation 13 and 15. Finally, the gospel made tremendous advances in the early decades of the church, and the tribulation period will also be a time of great evangelistic harvest, Revelation 7. Questions on that first part of the Olivet Discourse, and the case made for this being AD 70 and eschatological type and antitype.
I agree with what Duncan said, but yeah, it's coming into focus, and it's helpful. It's very helpful, and yeah, it's good. Thanks.
Yeah, I remember really until this year when I dug into this passage, I always felt like I never quite knew. It was so complex. I would hear a sermon on this and I would say, okay, but I'm still not sure what to make of all this. So some of this you may just need to dig in for yourself. It's not really, a lot of times, it's not really until you dig into something yourself that you really have things pulled together. But I did feel when I dug into this passage and took this approach, it felt like everything fell into place. So.
Yeah, I had taught some classes on the Gospels in the past, and every time I got to this section, I just felt awful because the time constraints I was under, I just never quite felt like I got anywhere close to scraping the surface, much less getting to the bottom of everything. And this has really been very helpful. I saw some of these posts go on your blog a while back, and I thought, oh, I have to read that, and never actually got to it. So I'm really glad I'm here today.
Oh, good. And I hope to get back. I haven't completed posting my thoughts on that, but I'll continue to do that, Lord willing, in the future. So I won't leave you hanging. But
please do. I mean, these posts are really helpful. The other thing that stuck out to me as you're talking through this is, I'm just repeating myself, but doing it this way really does highlight for me that I've been using a different method when I'm working with the Old Testament prophets, and I'm open to like typology and fulfillment. And then when I'm getting to the Olivet Discourse, I'm not allowing that. I'm just cutting that off as an interpretive option. It's got to be single referent long, single referent only. So anyway, this is helping me kind of pull those together and have some more continuity in the way that I'm processing the passages.
Yeah, and the other thing that gives me confidence is that this isn't just a, this has been held throughout church history. So now other views have been held throughout church history too, but it's not like, oh, this is a brand new thing. This is something that godly people have, and careful interpreters have seen, for a long time. So
it fits the shape of New Testament theology and the already not yet kind of thing. But I'll be quiet.
Yes. Now, brother, I'm going to ask your name appears as Aguinaldo Angeles, but is it giving your last name before the first name in the way it's showing on the screen? Anyway, brother, I see you have a question here. I just didn't want to say your name correctly.
Will be fine.
Okay. Is the Olivet Discourse exclusively related to the Jews? Because there are many Christians during that span of years from 30 to the destruction of Jerusalem. No, I don't see that as exclusively related to the Jews. I understand why people would say that. That's a common dispensational interpretation because of the eschatological focus during the tribulation period. I actually wonder if the Jews would be maybe more in the focus in the type though in AD 70, because during Revelation, we do see in chapter 7 of Revelation not just Jewish people being converted and sealed, but we see them spreading the gospel to Gentiles. So you have people from every nation in chapter 7 that are actually converted during the tribulation period. So I actually would not limit what's happening here just to the Jews. Other questions? And then we'll move on. We'll keep moving on. Oh, you're very welcome. I'm looking up Obadiah real quick here. Does this have a relation to Olivet Discourse? I'm gonna hold off on Obadiah at this point. Obadiah 4, because I'm not seeing a direct connection there to the Olivet Discourse, and I want to keep pressing ahead here with this. So let's look at Matthew 24:15 to 22 and its parallels, and kind of press ahead here. So what's happening here? Let me just give a real summary. In verse 15, we see the abomination of desolation, And then those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Those in the housetop are not supposed to go down, and the ones in the field are not supposed to turn back. There's woe here for women who are pregnant and nursing. They should pray that their flight wouldn't be during the Sabbath, because there's going to be a great tribulation, such as there has never been since the beginning of the world and never has been. And if the days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. That's Matthew. Now, this is another part where you're going to want to keep your finger in Luke chapter 21, verses 20 to 24, because that passage is going to be a little bit different. And I think, again, the differences here are significant. So in Luke chapter 21, verses 20 through 24, this is Jerusalem surrounded by armies, and then you'll know the end is near. It has people fleeing through the mountains and so forth. Now, I think what Jesus is doing here is he's directing the disciples' attention to Daniel's prediction about the abomination of desolation. I think there's some debate about this, but I think when Matthew, or I think maybe Mark as well, yes, when Matthew and Mark say, let the reader understand, I think that's Jesus speaking. Jesus is telling his hearers, let the reader of Daniel understand. I don't think that's Matthew and Mark saying, let the reader of the Olivet Discourse understand. Let the reader, Jesus saying, let the reader of Daniel understand. And he's saying, okay, I understand when I talk about the abomination of desolation, I am talking about the book of Daniel. Because that phrase, abomination of desolation, occurs in Daniel 9, 27, 11, 31, 12, 11, and there's a similar phrase in 8, 13. The Greek phrase used in Matthew and Mark appears in exactly the same form in Daniel 12:11, in at least one version of the Greek text. There's multiple versions, ancient translations of Daniel in Greek, but in one version it's the same. Mark actually alluded to Daniel 12:6-7 at the beginning of the discourse, if you remember. In that passage, Daniel 12 is eschatological, and it's looking forward to the tribulation period at the end of the age. It's parallel to Daniel 9:27. And Daniel 9:27 is the passage that locates the abomination of desolation in Daniel's 70th seven. And then the Daniel 8 and Daniel 11 passage both actually are referring to events during the time of Antiochus IV. That's prior to Christ. That's typological of the final abomination of desolation. And I think since the event preceded the incarnation, that can't be what Jesus is referring to here, because Jesus is referring to future events that are future to the time that he's still speaking. So that means that Daniel 9 and Daniel 12 are the relevant passages for us in here. Because the reference to Daniel is there, and I should just say Daniel 12 is clearly eschatological, and I would argue that Daniel 9 is also eschatological. That's the 70th seven. And we aren't going to have time to delve into that and argue for that. That may be widely believed by folks here in this class here. So we may not need to argue for that. But that's going to be my presumption here, that Daniel 70th seven is eschatological. Because of the reference to Daniel, which the reader is to understand, Matthew and Mark probably have this antitype, have the eschatological fulfillment in the foreground. Now, many have tried to identify a first century fulfillment. So could there be an abomination of desolation in connection with AD 70? Carson notes that some identify the installation of a false high priest as the abomination. This happened sometime before AD 70. Keener notes that Josephus talks about the shedding of priestly blood in the sanctuary, and that would have been a desecration of the sanctuary. And intriguingly, he observes that this happened very close to 3.5 years after the abomination. I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. Very close to the 3.5 years after the abomination of the shedding of the priest's blood, the temple was destroyed and violated even more terribly. Okay, so that I would say, okay, that's plausible, except for one thing. Mark indicates that the abomination of desolation is a person. So Mark 13:14 says, when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be. Though some suggest that the he is a reference to the one who does the desolating, or to an inanimate idol, I think the referent is best understood to be the abomination. James Edwards, in his Pillar commentary on Mark, he suggests that the abomination refers to the man of lawlessness that 2 Thessalonians 2:3-4 speaks of, who will exalt himself in the temple of God. Edwards observes that 2 Thessalonians 2:3-4 correlates with Mark 13:14 better than any other passage. So again, we have some intertextuality going on here between the Gospels and the epistles. Edwards says, the man of lawlessness corresponds to the man standing, masculine participle, in Mark 13:14. And the description of him is parroting God in the temple. That correlates with the abomination that causes desolation, standing where he does not belong. Both texts depict a blasphemous Antichrist who will do a scandalous deed that will trigger the return of the Lord. Both texts also warn disciples against mistaken eschatological assumptions, especially against being deceived by signs and wonders. Now, Davies and Allison, in their ICC commentary, they propose that 2 Thessalonians 2:3-4 is actually based on this teaching of Jesus, that Paul has this teaching from the Olivet Discourse in mind when he's writing. And thus, Mark and Matthew are indicating that Jesus foresaw the rise of the Antichrist, who at some future time will unleash a severe tribulation on the people of God, which will usher in the return of the Lord. Now, Paul, I think it's really interesting here, is once again interpreting the Olivet Discourse eschatologically. I think it's really fascinating that whenever Paul picks up on the Olivet Discourse, even though it's before the AD 70 event, what he's emphasizing is the eschatological element there. I have in my notes Thessalonians commentators that are also making the connection back to the Olivet Discourse here when they comment on 2 Thessalonians 2, but I'm gonna skip over that and just stay focused here on the Olivet Discourse. So I think in Matthew and Mark, what we have here is an eschatological focus. Duncan has a question about the NIV translation. I'm not sure why the NIV translates the way it does. But of course, Edwards, I'm gonna refer you to Edwards. Do you have Edwards on Mark Pillar commentary?
I think I do.
Yeah.
I can't remember if it's in Logos or on paper.
It is. It's in one of the. It's like in the silver package in Logos. So if you have up to that, you'll probably have it. I'm going to direct you there. Of course, he's commenting. He's in a commentary that is based off of the NIV. So he should deal with that for you. And Brother Kenneth, I am going to. I'm going to answer your question in like just a few seconds as I keep moving forward here. So we're on the same wavelength here. So Matthew and Mark are eschatologically focused, I think. Now the typical event which prefigures this eschatological abomination of desolation, I don't think is the priest having his blood spilled. I think it actually is the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple in AD 70. And I think Luke 21:20 is the passage that gives us that parallel there. Some commentators on Matthew and Mark argue that the destruction of Jerusalem cannot be the abomination of desolation because there would be no time to flee, as the text proposes, because people would need to flee the city before it fell. However, I want to make a distinction. If the abomination of desolation in Matthew and Mark is entirely future, but the desolation of Jerusalem in Luke in AD 70 is the type of that desolation, then I think that problem is resolved. Because the flight in Matthew and Mark is a reference to the far future event. And the flight in Luke in AD 70 in Luke is to the AD 70 event. Notice that in Matthew and Mark, the people flee when they see the abomination of desolation. In Luke, they flee when Jerusalem is compassed with armies before the desolation of Jerusalem. So again, I think Jesus gives us discourse in which he has both AD 70 and the eschatological day of the Lord in view. But as the Holy Spirit inspires the gospel writers to write, Matthew ends up focusing on the eschatological aspect, and Luke is focusing on the typological aspect. Does that answer your question, Brother Kenneth? Or do you want to follow up with that?
But okay, the thing is, if you look at the next verse, Luke 21:21, he says that those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So that could actually mean that it's not referring to those in Jerusalem, but the surrounding parts of Jerusalem.
You're right. That is true. So it would be when they see that Jerusalem is, the people in the surrounding areas, when they're see the armies surrounding Jerusalem, they flee to the mountains. But I don't see where that. Maybe expand on your question some more.
Because the same thing if you look at the parallels in Matthew and Mark, they also have the Judea part fleeing to the mountains. So it could be foreshadowing, or it could be actually referring to the single one event.
Right. I think what I'm picking up on is that the commentators all have trouble getting verse 15 of Matthew with the abomination of desolation and the desolation in Jerusalem in Luke 21:20. They have a hard time putting those two things together. Okay. And I'm arguing those are actually two separate things. Now, the response to those two separate things is actually the same. Right. But you're in AD 70, or if you're in the eschatological abomination of desolation, you're going to do the same thing.
Right.
But the two events that the two gospels are pointing to are actually two separate things. Now, how this would have, if I was going to do a harmony not in columns, but if I was going to try to like put all of this in a single flowing thing to reconstruct what Jesus actually said, how all that would fit together, I'm not quite sure how I would flow all that together. But that would be my understanding of the passage. Further thoughts from you?
Yeah, it could be. I do see your point, and well, I think let's carry on.
Okay, sounds good. Sounds good. So I think what's going on here is the events of AD 70 are in general a partial fulfillment of the prophecy as far as the destruction of the temple is concerned. The abomination of desolation in Matthew and Mark is eschatological. And I think it's striking that in both Mark and Matthew, the tribulation with respect to this abomination is clearly connected with the last days. So if you keep looking on how this follows, for then there will, in verse 21 of Matthew, for then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, never will be. If those days had not been shortened for the sake of the elect, those days would have been cut short. Don't let anyone lead you astray, because it'll be coming to the Son of Man will be visible like lightning. Verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the Son of Man will appear in the sky. So the way that Matthew flows, in Mark 2, the abomination is closely connected with the tribulation, which is said to immediately precede the coming of Christ. Now, in the description of the days of vengeance and the distress that follow the desolation, Luke's focus remains on the events surrounding the AD 70 destruction of Jerusalem. And I think this is most clearly indicated in the prediction that the Jews will be led captive among all the nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. That's Luke 21:24. This statement requires time to unfold. It certainly describes what happens after AD 70 until the present. In fact, I would argue the times of the Gentiles will persist until the Israelite king, the Davidic son, returns to rule the nations. Luke, I think, significantly omits the statements in Matthew and Mark that people shouldn't return to retrieve forgotten items. When Luke talks about that aspect of things, it's actually in a different passage, Luke 17. And in that passage, Luke is also speaking eschatologically. Luke also doesn't speak about unprecedented tribulation in the way that Matthew and Mark do. So I think the details in Luke fit well with the fall of Jerusalem. The Jews had to flee Jerusalem during the Jewish war. Jesus predicted that people, I think, and I have to look at this, what I have in my notes, and maybe Brother Kenneth will prompt me to look at the passage more carefully. But what I have in my passage, Jesus predicted that those who are in Jerusalem should leave it, and those in the country should not enter the city. And in fact, the Jews prior to the siege of Titus had fled from Jerusalem and Judea to Pella in the Transjordan. And then God's vengeance was poured out on that city, 21-22. So I think, as Gerald Bach says in his BECNT commentary on Luke, the focus of these remarks from the Lucan perspective is the events of AD 70. But Bach says it must be remembered that these remarks are part of a pattern of judgment, so they apply to the later period as well. So Luke gives us the pattern. Matthew and Mark are giving us what the eschatological fulfillment will be. Some people seek to restrict Matthew and Mark to AD 70. So for instance, Peter Bolt, he has a book on Mark in the New Studies in Biblical Theology. He responds to that. He says, Jesus' language here sounds rather excessive if it's limited to AD 70. He says, despite the fact that France argues that it does not outrun the detailed and lurid description of the siege of Jerusalem, he says, it's surely true that unless we view this statement as unbridled hyperbole, the warning that the period of tribulation will be so severe that unless shortened, it will extinguish human life, argues that the prophecy portends more than the Jewish war. What Matthew and Mark are talking about is the fate of all of humanity standing in the balance. This is not to minimize the events of AD 70, which truly foreshadowed an eschatological tribulation, but I think Bolt's argument stands. And it's bolstered by the allusion to Daniel 12:1. And there shall be, this is Daniel, there shall be a time of trouble such as never has been since there was a nation till that time. And Daniel here is describing, quote, the end of days. So, and then you to go back to Daniel 9, Daniel's linking the tribulation with deliverance of the Jewish people. That doesn't match AD 70, which is followed by the times of the Gentiles. It does fit the sequence of events connected to the return of Christ. So I think the accent of Matthew and Mark is on the future. The accent of Luke is on AD 70 there. Any further questions? Okay, we'll keep moving. Matthew 24, 23 to 28. Matthew, this is the passage that's warning, don't be deceived by false Christ, people saying here he is or there he is, because when the true return of Christ will be evident. It'll be like lightning in the sky. With regard to the time of these warnings' applicability, Alfred observes, these verses have but a faint reference, though an unmistakable one, to the time of the siege, but their principal reference is to the latter days. Josephus echoes this language when he speaks of various messianic impostors in the first century who deceived the masses, pretending to do wonders and signs. Here I'm quoting Strauss's commentary in the Zondervan exegetical set on Mark. Paul similarly says the man of lawlessness who sets himself in God's temple will use all sorts of displays through signs and wonders. The impressive nature of these false miracles will be such to deceive people. So Strauss pointed out a first century deception and an eschatological deception. But in contrast to these deceptions, Christ's second coming will be visible like lightning that flashes across the sky. There won't be any mistaking it. Christ's coming will also be like vultures gathered over a corpse. Now, there are 8 possible interpretations that Davies and Allison list in their commentary. I think the most likely are either the coming of the Son of Man will be as public and as obvious as eagles or vultures circling over the carrion, or the eschatological tribulation will be concluded by vultures destroying the flesh of the wicked dead, as in Ezekiel 39 or Revelation 19. The former is more likely, but the similarity to Revelation 19 makes me not want to completely dismiss that latter option. Now, Luke's version of the Olivet Discourse actually doesn't parallel Matthew and Mark at this point. Luke parallels Matthew and Mark, again in Luke 17 at this point, which is an eschatological passage in Luke. Any questions on this little section?
When you presented this before, I felt like the fact that you needed to trace out the different synoptics in order for some of this to become clear was a weakness, because you don't ever want it to be like, okay, so if you do this nuanced thing and you pull them all together, then my idea comes. But as you're doing it now, I really think this kind of analysis very much supports it very much supports the way you're going, because it is notable when they diverge, then you see the eschatological elements only getting included in one place. So anyway, some of those patterns really seem to support what you're saying.
Yeah, I think what helps is that Luke tends to lean a certain way and Matthew tends to lean a certain way. So it's not just that I'm kind of randomly saying, oh, now this one's doing this and this one's doing this, but in fact, the fact that these are the same discourse, they're recording the same discourse, but Luke is leaning away and Matthew is leaning away, I think tells me that I need to interpret it this way. If Luke is focused on AD 70 and Matthew is focused on eschatology, then the discourse actually has to have both of those elements when it gets put back together, you know, whatever the original form was that Jesus spoke it in. He had both in view. So I don't know if that helps.
And I'd like to think about this more, but the fact that Luke leans towards the first century fulfillment fits like the broader theology pattern of Luke Acts, because he's going to move from this into what the disciples are going to do. Anyway, that part fits. Yeah. I think a little bit about the eschatology side with Matthew, but anyway, clearly there's lots of eschatological emphasis woven into the theology of Matthew.
Right. Brother Aguinaldo, his question here is the section on Matthew 24, 23 to 26 about the church age that gives us some hint of the great day that Jesus is talking about is near. What Jesus is saying here actually would apply. You know, there's certain things that Jesus say that they would apply to all times. But I think in the flow of what Matthew is talking about, it's still eschatological. These are people in that day of the Lord time period saying, look, here's the Christ, or there's the Christ. So in some ways, this is a more generic part of the discourse. These are things that are always true. But I think in the flow, it is still eschatological. So a good point, Duncan, about verse 26. Although I could see verse 26 being something that would be happening, say, in the first century, people in the wilderness. If we want to look at that type antitype perspective there. Good. Well, let's keep forging forward. Matthew 24, 29 through 31. And this won't take us that long because this is not, unless you're NT Wright, this is not that debatable. With these, Brother Kenneth notes that, facts that would show how this would be applicable to all times, for sure. With these verses, 29 through 31, the sermon transitions from its bifocal vision on the already and the not yet to an exclusive focus on the not yet. And what is really helpful with here is in Luke, we get a hinge verse. So verse 21 of Luke 20, Luke 20, let me try this again. Luke chapter 21, verse 24 is a hinge verse. It says that they will fall by the edge of the sword, be laid captive among all the nations. So that's AD 70. And Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles. That's all this time from AD 70 up until the return of Christ, until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Okay, when the times of Gentiles are fulfilled, Then there will be signs in the sun and the moon and so forth. So Luke has had this 80-70 focus, but now he has this hinge verse that brings him all the way up to the eschatological period that Matthew and Mark have been focused on. The times of the Gentiles stretch from the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 till the coming of the Son of Man. Matthew and Mark transition by describing the tribulation that follows the abomination of desolation in terms readers now know apply most directly to the final eschatological tribulation. So that's verses 21 through 22 of Matthew 24. And then Matthew and Mark locate these verses, here's Matthew's wording, immediately after the tribulation of those days. And Mark's wording, in those days after that tribulation. So it really connects those things tightly. Now, I think these verses are most challenging to that first interpretation that we talked about at the very beginning, the interpretation that this would all be fulfilled in AD 70. That's called the preterist reading. I think these verses are the most challenging for the preterist reading. Now, R.T. France, who takes that reading, he argues that Matthew 24 and its parallel Mark is entirely focused on the disciples' question regarding the destruction of the temple. And he doesn't think that the topic shifts to the second coming until verse 36, concerning that day and hour no one knows. Thus, the coming of the Son of Man of the clouds, France says, is not the return of Christ, but his heavenly enthronement when he ascended up to heaven in Acts chapter 1. France argues that the cosmic language of Matthew 25-29 in its parallels is Old Testament language for, quote, far-reaching political change, and that Daniel 7 in its original context is about the enthronement of the Messiah in heaven, not his return to earth. So what is seen is the Son of Man not literally returning in the clouds, but the effects of his enthronement, the destruction of the temple expressed in strong visual imagery and the gathering of an international people of God, in France's words. Now, I think the difficulties of this are manifold, and I'm going to draw largely on a critique that Thomas Schreiner gives in his New Testament theology, but also on some other people as well. First, the statement that the Son of Man will be seen coming in the clouds is best taken to his being actually seen by people, rather than being quote unquote seen in the events of AD 70. Because Acts 1:11 sets the precedent for what coming in the clouds will be. It's something visible. Second, for Jesus to come, quote, with power and great glory, Matthew 24:30, most likely indicates the coming is visible. I don't see how a coming with great glory, that points to a visible coming. Third, the accompanying allusion to Zechariah 12:10 through 12 confirms the eschatological timing of this event. The Zechariah 12:10 through 12 is every eye will see him and they'll mourn. Fourth, the event is pictured as lightning that comes from the east and shines as far as the west, which indicates that the coming of Christ is referred to as a visible and unmistakable coming, which is certainly not true with what France is talking about. Fifth, and here I'm going to rely on the work of Jonathan Pennington, who did an excellent book on the heaven language in Matthew. Fifth, the singular heaven in Matthew is used to indicate the visible earthly world, and the plural is used to indicate the invisible divine realm. The use of the singular heaven in verse 30 indicates that the Son of Man is appearing in the visible heaven. Sixth, the imagery is derived from the Old Testament passages about God's end time coming. I'm noting this from a monograph by a man named Adams that is excellent on this end time imagery. Seventh, I. Howard Marshall rightly observes that the cosmic signs cannot be interpreted as purely political events. And Edwards Adams, this man that I mentioned that did this monograph on these cosmic signs, his survey of the cosmic catastrophe language in Jewish apocalyptic literature demonstrates that, quote, in all those texts which employ global and or cosmic catastrophic language, more than local socio-political change is in view. In many cases, the final judgment is envisaged. In some cases, the heavenly disorders are preliminary, but even so, in all cases, the actual celestial abnormalities seem to be in view. And eighth, David Turner, this is in his Baker commentary on Matthew, notes that the global language of Matthew 24 points toward an eschatological coming. And then ninth, Turner also warns about the danger of minimizing the full scope of Jesus's eschatological teaching. He says, one difficulty with preterism is its truncation of Jesus' eschatology, which brings the reign of heaven to earth and renews the world. If all of this has already occurred, one wonders at the underwhelming denouement of the glorious fulfillment promised by the biblical prophets, John and Jesus himself. So, I could do more. I don't think I will on arguing that Daniel 7 is actually not about the heavenly enthronement of Christ, but actually his return and his earthly enthronement. But any questions on that section? I know that was a lot to take in, but if anyone is saying, boy, that preterist reading, or that reading that everything was all fulfilled in AD 70, that's attractive to me. This would be a good time to talk through that.
Is there any chance that we can read Daniel 7 as kind of having the same sort of echo effect, in the sense that, so like a Psalm 110 kind of sense, he sits down, but this is, or a Psalm 110 Acts 2 sort of sense. He sits down on the throne, but you're just seeing a little picture of what it's going to be when he sits down on the earthly throne.
Yes, so I would say that Daniel 7 is about the referent of the events that Daniel 7 is about his return to earth and enthronement on earth, Revelation 19 and 20. But I would also say that Acts 1 and some of these other passages are actually intentionally picking up on Daniel language to echo that in terms of his heavenly enthronement. His heavenly enthronement is marking kind of a stage towards, that's ultimately going to be fulfilled in his return and enthronement on earth. So I definitely think there's connections there. I just don't think that that's the referent of the passage. Brother Kenneth, do you want to expand on your question there about Jesus standing or sitting?
Okay, because like he says that you will see the Son of Man at his trial before the Pharisees. He says you will see the Son of Man at the right hand of power.
Yes.
Then also Stephen in his testimony, Acts 7 or 6, refers to him standing. I mean, is there some difference or something that we should and also a lot of because I'm doing the Psalm 110 thing.
Yes.
Yeah, so right now he is sitting, but then again you have this standing thing. So a little bit, I'm not sure how exactly do we reconcile this.
So the standing would be in the Acts 7 passage, and right. That I think is just a way of the Lord expressing honor to Stephen in terms of his martyrdom. So I would say that in general, the sitting language is what would characterize that whole period. And then he's going to come in enthroned and be seated eschatologically as well. Now, the other passage you mentioned was Matthew 26:64. And that's a passage that France makes a big deal about. Matthew 26:64, Jesus is speaking to this is his trial before Caiaphas, and he says, "You have said so, that I'm the Christ, the Son of God. But I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, coming on the clouds of heaven."
Yeah.
And he wants to say, see, the now on, the terminus a quo, the beginning of that is AD 70. But I think that's a problem, because from now on doesn't admit a delay of several decades, which France's view is going to have to require. I think it's better to understand Jesus is saying that from the cross forward, they would not see him as he now stands before them being judged, but only in his capacity as the undisputed King Messiah and sovereign judge. And I do think there's an already not yet aspect of that passage. But that already not yet aspect is there because In this verse, there's allusions to Daniel 7:13 paired with an allusion to Psalm 110. Psalm 110 was fulfilled when he ascended to heaven and was enthroned. Daniel 7:13 is his return to be enthroned on earth. And in the Olivet Discourse, Revelation 1:7, and in Revelation 1:7, Daniel 7:13 allusion is paired with an allusion to Zechariah 12:10. And that combination of allusions focuses on the not yet, whereas the Matthew passage, by its combination of allusion, gave us an already not yet flavor. So I think in Matthew, what's interesting here is the way that the writers bring different texts together give us different flavors, an already not yet flavor or a eschatological flavor. Does that make sense?
Yeah, a lot to digest. But I think also in Revelation 7, is it when he starts opening the seals, the Lamb of God is at the right hand of the Father, standing, and he opens the seals. So that's like he's already starts the tribulation.
Correct. Yes, and so I would see that as preceding the Daniel 7. But I don't know if this is the right. I don't know how much to put on that weight to put on that imagery. But maybe the standing is indicating, okay, I'm no longer seated. I'm standing because I'm beginning the coming. I'm beginning the judgments.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Dr. K has asked that before time runs out, we move on to this generation. So let's move to that. So that would be Matthew 24, 32. Pull that up in front of me here. This is the fig tree and so forth. Now this is after, I would say, the first major section of the Olivet Discourse, and this is now reflection on what we've talked about. So we've already had the whole day of the Lord kind of presented, and now Jesus is going back and he's reflecting on what is happening. In the fig tree parable, when the fig tree puts out its leaves, it's clear the summer is near. And when all these things are seen, Jesus' disciples should know that Jesus is near. He's at the very door. And I think that's straightforward enough, but then it's complicated by this explanation. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Now, for the preterists, this is the linchpin of their interpretation. They say, see, this generation is Jesus's generation. It's the generation of the disciples right there. All these things need to happen in this generation, so this all has to happen in AD 70. However, understanding this generation doesn't actually necessitate that interpretation. So Herman Bavinck explains, the words "this generation" cannot be understood to mean the Jewish people. That's one way to get around this, to say, okay, this generation refers to all the Jewish people throughout history. But Bavinck says it undoubtedly refers to the generation then living. On the other hand, it is clear that the words "all these things" do not include the parousia itself. This is a lengthy quotation. I'm going to paste this into the chat, so you can have this while I speak. And that was too much text. I told you this was a long quotation. It didn't even accept the whole. Let me. There we go. Okay, so Bavinck says this does refer to the generation in Jesus's day. But he says, on the other hand, it is clear that the words "all these things" do not include the parousia, or the coming itself, but only refer to the signs that precede and announce it. For after predicting the destruction of Jerusalem and the signs of his return, and even the gathering of his elect by the angels, and therefore actually ending his eschatological discourse, Jesus proceeds in verse 32 to offer a practical application. Here he states that just as in the case of the fig tree, the sprouting of leaves announces the summer. So, quote, all these things are signs that the end is near, or that the Messiah is at the door. Here the expression panta tata, all these things, clearly refers to the signs of the coming parousia, not to the parousia itself, for else it would make no sense to say that when these things occur, the end is quote unquote near. In verse 34, the words all those things have the same meaning. Jesus therefore does not say that his parousia will still occur within the time of the generation then living. What he says is that the signs and portents of it, as they would be visible in the destruction of Jerusalem and the concomitant events, would begin to occur in the time of the generation then living. Of this, Jesus is so sure that he says that while heaven and earth will pass away, his words will by no means pass away. For the rest, however, Jesus abstains from all attempts at further specifying the time. And this is from Bavinck's Dogmatics, volume 4, page 687, in answer to Duncan's question there. So, according to Bavinck, the generation that Jesus was speaking that would experience all these things, they would experience them in terms of the type. And then after AD 70, no further events must be fulfilled before the return of Christ. Christ is at the door and could step through at any time. Now, someone could object. They say, well, some of the things mentioned before are clearly eschatological. And you say, well, even those eschatological items have their typical counterparts. So I think that remains a possible, I think Bavinck's explanation is a real possible explanation. The other option here is that the generation that sees all these things is perhaps some future generation, and that this refers not to the generation hearing Jesus speak, but to the generation about whom Jesus was ultimately speaking. When they see these things take place, they know the return is near. And it may even be possible that both of these are correct in the mixture of the type, antitype function of the discourse. I do think there's a possibility that some of the following passages that talk about people being caught up unawares does refer to the rapture. And I do think what's going on here is there are all these signs that people are seeing. But Jesus is saying in this passage here, nobody's going to know the day or the hour. This is going to catch everybody unawares. And I think the way to harmonize that is there are no signs leading up to the day of the Lord. When the day of the Lord begins, no man knows that day or the hour. But once you're interior to the day of the Lord, all these signs that we've been talking about that occur within the day of the Lord, before the coming proper, all those things will be seen. Well, that was a lot in the last little bit of time, and of course we've gone a little bit over time. Dr. Arnold, what do you want to do here? I'm happy to stay. I have all day until lunch. Answer questions. So I'm happy to stay, but whatever you want to do here.
Wow. Hard question. So, I mean, if you wanted, and maybe we can make this a thing that's just however it works for everyone's schedule, because it's late on this end. But if you wanted to take another like 5 or 10 and see what we can get through or kind of wrap it up, great. And then if people need to go, absolutely, totally understand. Thank you for offering your time like that. I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
Oh, happy to. I'm enjoying having a day off and doing this. This is great. So yeah, I'll jump into the into this a little bit more then. Jesus, after the fig tree parable, Jesus says something that seems in tension with the mention, and this is what I just tried to summarize, like in a couple sentences. I'm going to expand on that about the signs and the not signs. Jesus says something that seems in tension with the mention of signs throughout the discourse and in the previous parable, because the fig tree is actually referring. The parable of the fig tree is actually referring to signs, right? When it shows that these things are near. This is what he says in verse 36. But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. Now, I think the subject has changed here, indicating by the phrase, but concerning. And instead of now talking about the coming narrowly conceived or the coming proper, conceived in its culmination, I think now we're talking about this entire complex event that the discourse has been about. And we're talking about that whole thing as the coming. When people talk about the coming of the Lord, I don't think it just refers to Revelation 19. I think the coming of the Lord oftentimes refers to that whole event that begins with the rapture, continues throughout the day of the Lord tribulation, and culminates in the coming proper, the actual return to earth. So now we're talking about that whole period of time as the coming. And the day referred to in these verses is the day of the Lord. So I'm going to look at verse 36 here. Concerning that day, that's the day of the Lord, and the hour, no one knows. So that's the day of the Lord. And again, that day is that whole complex of events. And I think the meaning is likely here, in light of the close parallels between the parable and the return of the owner of the house. That's the parable that follows. And the return of the Son of Man. I think it's indicating that that whole period is not going to be known. That's going to come upon us unawares. And thus there's no contradiction between verse 36 saying no one's going to know the day or the hour, and the signs, because the signs, again, are all interior to the day of the Lord, whether viewed typically or in its ultimate fulfillment. But these verses here about no one knowing the day, knowing the day or the hour, they're about the commencement of the day of the Lord. Now Matthew 24:36 also sets the theme for the following illustrations and parables. And it's important to keep in mind while reading this section that the coming here refers, again, not simply to the climactic coming, but to the entire day of the Lord, as a coming in judgment that culminates in the Son's return to earth. And again, I think this accounts for the fact that earlier in the discourse, certain very specific signs are mentioned, where in this section, the total unexpectedness of the coming is emphasized. And Brother Aguinaldo, if I'm understanding your question correctly, I would say that no one knows the day or the hour when the coming begins, when the day of the Lord begins. But the people that are living through that tribulation period, they're going to be aware something very unusual is happening here. They're not going to be going around thinking, oh, this is life as normal. No, they're going to know they're under a day of the Lord judgment. And they should know that that time of his final return to earth is very near. I've actually reached the end of my notes on this. I will say again, in verses 38, which talks in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, and they were unaware when the flood came and swept them off. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Again, I think that's the beginning of the day of the Lord, the beginning of this coming. 2 men will be in the field, and one will be taken, one will be left. I'm inclined to see that as the rapture. 2 will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken, one will be left. Therefore, stay awake. You do not know on what day your Lord is coming. I would take that as the rapture by combining that. I already believe in a pre-tribulational rapture from other passages. And so then when I read this and I say, oh, well, the part of the coming that I don't know about is actually at the beginning of the day of the Lord, not at the end, this seems to harmonize really well with that.
That's great. A lot of pieces in here that I need time to assimilate, keep on thinking through, but just on an initial reading and understanding what you've presented, it's making a lot of sense. It's helpful, very helpful. Anyone else want to add something? Or go ahead, Dr. Collins. Or...
Yeah, Duncan asked a question. He said, he asked if we should expect that once the day of the Lord begins, there will be more consensus among Bible readers that the day has begun. Yeah, I think so. Revelation 6, again, they actually talk about, towards the end of that, they actually talk about people crying out. Let me get that in front of me. But it seems like they're actually crying out knowing that they're under the judgment of God. Yeah, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand? Now, this is not necessarily saying these are quotations from the future that got recorded here, but it does seem to say that people are aware they're under the judgment of God at this point, but their hearts are hardened against it. That at least is how I would interpret that. Yeah, and further on you get into Revelation, the very severity of these things, I think, is going to cause people to say, yeah, of course, if you're pre-tribulational, you won't miss the signs anyway, because you'll be watching from heaven. But if you're post-tribulational, yeah, I don't think you'll be missing them. Now, my nephew asked me the other day. He said, "What's the difference between pre-tribulational and post-tribulational?" And I said, well, the post-tribulationalists are the ones that go through the tribulation period. I said, the pre-tribulationalists are the ones that are raptured out before. I don't want to go through, so that's why I'm pre-tribulational. He's in high school. He said, really? And I said, no, not really. But
Great. We can finish up the time here. We've taken up enough of your Thanksgiving, and really appreciate all the time that's represented in this. So, I mean, you're just presenting it, but there's immense amount of time and work that's gone into pulling this data together. Thank you.
Oh, really enjoyed it.
You also saw what Duncan linked in here, that there's content on his website. And here, just in case maybe you missed it, make sure you do check out the website. There's a lot of content there, not just on this topic, but other topics as well. So I just dropped that in the chat. So anyway, make use of that. And then one other comment here, our next lecture will be with Dr. Oberlin on Monday. So we're coming into the last week. Reminder, Dr. Oberlin on Monday, and then we're asking you to give your presentations next Thursday, a week from today. Expect to take at least 10 minutes per person and just present through an example or two of intertextuality and how you understand how these passages work. So that's it for tonight. Dr. Collins, thank you again. Hope you have a great Thanksgiving. I really appreciate your labor of love here and ministry to us.
Thank you. It was good to be with everyone again, and it was great. Thank you.
Thank you all. Okay, good night.